and I were chatting, and I said to her, we're either going to have a full house tonight or there's going to be a little group of people. And she said, well, which ones do you choose? And I said to her, I really don't care as long as they're receptive of the message that I portray to them from the scriptures. So it's good to be here with everybody here this evening. And as you can tell, I'm speaking on the responsibility to the government. And I remember the conversation that I was having with Bauer and Bill, where I said to them when we arrived, please can I meet you guys for coffee? I'd like to chat to you about the work that's happening here and find out if this is where Lindy and I would like to place membership. And what was supposed to be me interviewing them to find out a little bit about the work here, Byron threw it and said, well, can we add you onto the full focus for preaching? And I said to him, sure, send me over the paperwork, let me have a look at it, and then I'll come back to you. Well, the very next week, I saw my name on Shane's notice that went out on Sunday morning, Richard's preaching on the responsibility to government. And I thought, well, that's a great one, because I'm here coming from South Africa. I've been trying to get here for the last, it took us probably about 2.5 years to get here. We were supposed to come beginning of 2020. COVID hit. Your American government shut down the borders for South Africans, and we sat waiting. We fought with the government. We fought with our government. And at the end of the day, it took us 2.5 years to get here. And as I was thinking about this, I thought, hey, this is brilliant. I have worked with so many governments in my career that I'm probably a product expert here. I've worked with the South African government. I've worked with Mozambique, Botswana, Namibia, your American government in terms of my immigration here. And I've worked with the World Bank in terms of the people that oversee a lot of the banking integrations across countries around the world. I've worked with them. It's not easy, but every single time that I've gone to war with them, I've won. And the reason for that is because I grew up in the church. And people look at me funny when they say that, and they go, well, why? And I go, well, at 12 years old, I was the little kid that used to sit in the background, not make a noise, not make a peep, and you wouldn't hear from me. And through preacher training and given the opportunity to stand up in the assembly to preach, to pray, to lead in the Lord's Supper, to lead with singing, I was able to build up my confidence that I don't care who I'm talking to, I treat them like a human being, and there's a mutual respect that goes backwards and forwards. So I thought, perfect. Now, one of the places that I never told you in terms of the government that I've had dealings with was Uganda. 2009, I was sent through to Uganda to go and install servers for the first credit bureau to go live in Uganda. We didn't want to pay our taxes though. So I built up all the servers, all these computer equipment worth millions of dollars, pulled all the hard drives out of them so that they had no installed software on them, put them in my backpack, and shipped all the servers off to Uganda. When we arrived in Uganda, they pulled me aside and they said, young man, why have you got 128 hard drives in your backpack? I said, it's all my backups for all the data I'm coming to collect here. Well, it wasn't a full lie, but it was a little bit of a bending of the truth. 3 nights later, I was arrested. Unfortunately, the Ugandan police would not allow me to take a photo, so I had to reenact it. No, that's not really me, that's just a headshot that I superimposed on there. But I was arrested for not having my passport with me. And I thought, okay, so what do I do now? They arrested us as we walked out of a shopping complex, myself and about 50 other people. And they took us down to the holding cells, and they said, well, you're not going to get out of here until you produce your passports. And I said, well, I can't, because they're all locked away at work, and I don't have access to that. I'm locked up, so how must I produce my passport if I'm locked up? Not a single time at that moment when I was being arrested and locked up, and I fought against being arrested because I said, this is a free country. You can't arrest me. I know my rights within Uganda. You can't arrest me because on what ground? They said, well, you don't have your passport. And I said, that's not any reason to be arrested. This is a free country, and actually your immigration officer said to us when we came in, lock your passports away because you get pickpocketed. They said, well, if you're not going to willfully be arrested, we will forcefully arrest you. And they forcefully arrested me by putting an AK-47 under my chin and escorted me into the vehicle. Around 50 of us, ranging from the youngest was a 9-year-old girl all the way up to a 70-year-old man. Her parents were not told. But at no point during that arrest was I nervous. Why? Because one, I treated everybody with utmost respect. I treated their office as somebody of the government, right or wrong in what they were doing. And by the end of the night, about 5 hours later, we were all released for a number of different reasons. And when I thought about this story, I thought, well, maybe I'm not the product expert anymore. Because if I was, I wouldn't have been arrested. And then I thought about all of this, and I thought, well, what does this have to do with my responsibility as a Christian to the government and the full focus lessons? And that got me thinking. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through to 18. And I'm going to read it because I didn't put everything up here. But if you would like to, 1 Peter chapter 2, starting at verse 13 says, "Be subject to the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as set by him, to punish those who do evil, and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should be put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God." Verse 17, "Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust." Well, God is our authority, and when we read these verses, it clearly states in verse 13, "Be subject to for the Lord's sake, to every human institution." Well, when I look at that, I go, well, there's the government. I need to be subject to them. And this got me thinking to go, well, to what extent? When do I need to be in subjection? When don't I need to be in subjection? Because we will touch on it a little bit later, where I firmly believe that the scriptures tells us we sometimes need to go against what the government tells us to do. And then I started thinking about the comparisons between God's authority and the authority of the government. As a Christian, we're able to come before our master for the sins that we have done and seek forgiveness. We're able to seek forgiveness, and have our slate washed clean. It's a little bit different under the government's authority, though. Why? Because here in America, I'm still figuring out your legal system. Okay, it's a little bit different to what I know in South Africa. So if I get a little bit technical wrong, just bear with me. But if I'm driving down the road and I'm doing 85 in a 60 zone, and a policeman pulls me over and gives me a fine, not only am I going to get a fine, but I'm also going to have some points added onto, or deducted, however it works here, from my driver's license that sits there for X period of time. And that kind of got me thinking about the old law under the Old Testament, where you didn't really have forgiveness of sins. You kind of had this little book that everything was written down, and when you ask for forgiveness, you kind of go like, okay, well, we'll turn the page, but it's still there. Whereas with God's law, I can fall before him and go, please forgive me of the sin that I've committed, and I can have full forgiveness of sins, forgotten, never to be remembered anymore. But what I do know from here is that I need to be subject, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution. Like with the government, we have to pay taxes. Like with the government, we are given the opportunity to vote. With the government, we are given ample opportunity to abide by the law and stay within the boundaries of what the law allows us to do. Before we go on to the next slide, I just want to read verse 19 of 1 Peter chapter 2. And it says, For this is a gracious thing, when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. COVID was a very, very interesting time in South Africa. 25th of March 2020, the South African government said, we are going to shut down everything for 3 weeks. We just want to kill the curve. Well, what does that mean? No school, no work. Yay, we all celebrate. No religious gatherings of any kind. What happens now? Along with all these other things, they then extended our 3-week lockdown for about 6 months. For 6 months, it was illegal for us as Christians to meet anywhere to worship our God. We were in a unique position because we met in my parents' home. We were a group of about 35 at the time. And between the relationship that my dad had with local law enforcement and myself, because we were involved with the neighborhood watches, we were very active in our area in terms of Crime Stop and all of that type of thing. We approached them and said, we understand your law, but we have a requirement to meet on the first day of the week. And under the table, they kind of said to us, hey, you know what? As long as no one complains, we'll turn a blind eye to what's happening in your home. And it was difficult for us because as Christians, we all needed to support each other. We all needed to be considerate of what everybody had in mind about how to deal with COVID. Do you get the vaccine? Don't you get the vaccine? Do you have the mask? Don't you wear the mask? Whatever the case is. And it caused a little bit of ruffling of the feathers amongst us, because I took the approach and said, I'm prepared to go to jail if they come and arrest me, because I know that on the first day of the week, I need to meet with my God. If you don't want to be there, that's your decision. And some people took offense to that, right or wrongfully so, because they said, yeah, but Richard, it's easy for you because it's at your parents' home and it's easy to go under the radar and whatever else. And I said, at the end of the day, we all need to make a decision for ourselves. And I've had some good chats with some of the men here about what happened during COVID here in America. And I know that things were very different to South Africa. And I can only talk from my viewpoint around what happened. But I hope and pray that no matter what happened during COVID, when something like that happens again, because I do believe that there will come a time again when something else comes that may cause us to shut our doors and close our windows and, separate ourselves from each other, how will we react differently? Will we be more understanding of the situation to say, well, the government says we're not allowed to meet with each other to worship our God, but the Bible says we need to meet on the first day of the week. What do we do? So it was just an interesting thought process that I went through in terms of God's authority and what he wants us to do versus what the government instructs us to do. And this got me thinking back to the old law, and I thought, well, when did God's people first get their official king? Now I'll take you back to 1 Samuel, where the children of Israel went to Samuel and said, we want a king. Well, why do you want a king? Because we want to be like the other nations. We want to have a king that can look after us, that we can go to, that can take us to war, that can lead us in war. We want to have a king. And Samuel said to them, just know that if you get a king, you're going to be taxed. They're going to take your maidservants. They're going to take your men. They're going to make warriors out of them. You're going to lose loved ones. They will take 1/10 of your fold in terms of your livestock, your pigs, your sheep, your cattle. And their response was, we don't care. We want a king. And Samuel went back to God and they had a conversation about it. And God said, it's not you that they are rejecting. It is me. And that's when the children of Israel got their first king. And I want to read 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 19 through to 22, which is when Samuel went back and warned the children of Israel. He said, but the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we may also be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And when Samuel had heard of all these words of the people, he repeated them to the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey their voice and make them a king. Samuel then said to the men of Israel, go, every man to his city. I don't know what the world would be like if the children of Israel had never asked for a king. In my mind, I've always had this dream of one day owning an island, and the only way that you're allowed to get onto the island is to be a Christian. Now, I'm not going to focus on the part of, well, how do you teach those that are lost to be saved? I don't want to think about that. But what about this island where it's all Christians? We don't have to worry about locking our doors. And I know that's a bit of a foreign concept here in America, but in South Africa, we lock our doors, we lock our safety gate, we lock the lock after the safety gate, and we barricade all of our windows at night. we wouldn't have to worry about any of that. We wouldn't have to worry about doing a business deal and wondering if the person's being honest with us or not. We wouldn't have to worry about breaking the speed limits. That would be a really rough, hard one for me to stick to, but we're on an island. How fast can you go on an island? And I sat and thought about it, and I thought, well, how different would the world be? How different would the world be now if we were able to teach our governments to be God-fearing? Now, I know that when we look at American history, we have, and I say we because I'm part of you guys now. Sorry, I'm part of y'all now. It's no longer you guys, it's y'all. I know that when we go back and we have a look at the presidents, there have been some presidents that, according to the world, have been God-fearing people, that have wrung out good morals. But how different would it be right now if we were able to sit Joe Biden down over here, teach him the gospel, and he said, you're right. And tomorrow he goes back into office and starts to change all these rules that we've got that are totally against God. How different would the world be? I've thought about it before when we lived in South Africa. Like I say, my dad and I were very much involved with the neighborhood watches. We worked very closely with the police force in our area, with the political leaders in our area. And I often thought, well, Richard, maybe you need to get into politics. And the more that I sit and think about it, the more I kicked against the idea. Because I can't imagine ever being a successful politician if I use the Bible as my measurement. There's way too much backhanded and everything that goes along with it for me to truthfully stand up and say, well, I'm a politician and I am 100% committed to walking my footsteps as what we have in the scriptures. And it's a sad thing to think about, because if we were able to get a Christian president, I really do believe the world would be a different place. So I go back to Samuel and I go, well, Samuel, they didn't reject you, but they rejected God in terms of saying, we want a king. And we can go back and have a look at history of the Old Testament, of how the children of Israel, in some situations they suffered, some situations they thrived in terms of having a king. Now, you may look at me and go, well, Richard, a king is not a government. It's the same thing. It's just a transition. When you have a look at the United Kingdom at the moment, they have a queen. They had a queen. They now have a king. It's the same thing. It's the ruling party that sits at the top that ultimately takes all your taxes and is supposed to run the country. And that got me thinking and saying, well, how smart is God in his foundation of, one, the authority in the political spectrum versus the church? Now, I watch a lot of shows on Netflix around Vikings, the Middle Ages, all of that type of stuff. And included in that one is The Curse of Oak Island, which is a mystery recovery program. But there's a lot of references back to the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar were a formidable force that went under the banner of being Christians, for lack of a better word. And then I look at the involvement of the Catholic Church within, even today, certain government institutions, and I say, as soon as you start trying to blend the church running government and the government running church, bad things happen. And the more that I read up and studied in preparation for this lesson, the more that I realized God's wisdom in making sure that those two things were separate and set apart. I asked myself the question, what would our lives be like if we still had priests or elders leading us as a nation? You know, Samuel, he was a prophet. They led the nations, the children of Israel. How would our lives be different if that was still the case now? Now, I can't imagine it, just because it's something so foreign to me that I've never been around and never been involved in, that I just can't imagine it. But what I do think it would have been like was a much better place than we are now. We'd probably have been set apart and set aside from the world. It's not to say that we wouldn't go out and preach and to teach and to bring those in. But it would have been a very different world that we live in now. Okay, well, it's a far out reach to think about a Christian in terms of the president. Well, what about our local councillors? Or governors, I think is what you guys would call them. What about our school principals that are also authoritative figures? What about our mayors of our towns? How different the world would be, our world would be, if we had political people that were Christians. I want to have a look at Romans chapter 13, and I'm going to read this because there's quite a bit here that I want to go over, and I wasn't able to put it all up on my slide. But Romans chapter 13, starting at verse 1 says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." Well, there's a lot going on in that verse, in those couple of verses. And I've highlighted just two things here. First of all, be subject to the governing authorities. Paul carries on to say, because these have been put in place by God. Well, what is our duty as a Christian? Our duty as a Christian is to be followers of Christ, to do the things that he tells us to do. Don't do this, well then don't do it. Be kind to your neighbor, be kind to your neighbor. Do it. So when the government says to me, "Hey Richard, you need to pay taxes," what's our attitude to it? Do we grumble? Do we moan? Or do we willfully pay up our taxes? I have a different perspective to taxes than what you all do, because I come from South Africa, where I paid my taxes. In actual fact, I paid more than what was due. My viewpoint on taxes is this: hey government, take all that you want, but render the service for what you're taking my taxes for. In South Africa, we also have 911. It's just run by a private entity. I've been involved before where people call 911 because somebody's breaking into their home and nobody arrives. 4 hours later, the policeman rocked up to find out what was wrong. Well, in the meantime, the neighbor had called Richard at 3 o'clock in the morning and said, "Somebody's breaking into my house, please come and help." That makes me a little bitter towards paying taxes. What about the roads that we drive down? What about the school system that's supposed to raise up our children, teach them? Here in America, I don't know enough about it, but I do know that if I call 911, probably 99.9% of the time, somebody's going to rock up. For that, I'll pay my taxes. How much do you want? Carries on in verse 7. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. We've had a couple of things show up in the news over the last 2 or 3 years that are pretty political. We've had movements that have rioted through the streets. We've had policemen being pulled over and shot because they're profiling a certain individual that doesn't meet what the media wants them to be profiling. Well, when I was arrested in Uganda, I was one of 3 white people that were arrested that night. Locked up in a little cell that was probably half the size of that little wing over there, 50 of us. And I mentioned to you earlier on, I was not afraid once during that whole process, even when I had the gun shoved up under my chin. And now that I sit back and I realize it, and when I look at my scriptures, funnily enough, the answer to me is simple. I knew I was innocent of what they were accusing me. The law was on my side. Doesn't mean that I thought I wasn't James Bond and trying to look for a way to escape out of that little holding cell. I did. But luckily the police came just in time to release us before I had to go all James Bond on them. But what I did realize, and what it shows me more and more and more, is that as Christians we should not fear the law. Who is the law? And when I say the law, I mean the law of the land. The laws that are there. The people that should fear those laws are those that are breaking the law. My wife sticks to the speed limits way better than what I do. She doesn't have to worry about the policeman coming up behind her, lights blaring and pulling her over. No, that's me. Why? Because Richard's got a bit of a heavy foot. Richard likes to be in the fast lane. It's hard for me sometimes. Every time I see a cop car coming up in my rearview mirror in America, I go, oh dear, here it comes. This is going to be my first pullover. My South African accent has got me into some trouble since I've been in America because I say things different to how you guys do, but it's also got me out of trouble. And I'm waiting for that day to go, sorry, Mr. Policeman, I got confused between kilometers and miles per hour, because I still honestly do. Driving down the interstate at 70 miles an hour, I go, this is so slow. And when I put it into kilometers, I go, okay, well, it's not that bad. Could be a bit faster. But then I read these verses and I go, God put these authorities in place. God put the government institutions in place. Whether I want to, whether I like it or not, I have an obligation to be obedient to those institutions. It's hard sometimes, brethren. It's hard, especially when I look at my situation of Lindy and I, newlyweds. We are eager to start a family, but we don't want to have a baby mid-transitioning from South Africa to America. We take everything that she owns, we take everything that I own, and we put them all together into one home, and then we start selling it off because we're going to America. 2 years later, we're still going to America. We've got no family. When I say no family, I mean we don't have a kid. We haven't started to raise a family because we didn't want to have that child through the transition of moving from from South Africa to America. We're living with the basics. We don't want to buy anything because we're going to America. Well, you know what? It did make me a little resentful to the US government. Why? Because you've put my life on hold. Now that we're here, I want to pay my taxes. But Richard, you're not allowed to work. Why? Well, you're just here on a spousal visa. Lindy's the one that gets to go off to work, and I just get to stay at home and wash the dishes. It's hard to be obedient to the government sometimes, especially when you think you know better than them. In hindsight, I've gone more and looked at the law of the land. I agree with the law of the land in terms of wanting to protect the American people first. I get it. But hey, I want to pay my taxes. In the meantime, I'm still able to show respect to who it is due. I'm still able to do these things. I'm still able to obey the laws of the land, obey the speed limits. Lindy is still able to pay her taxes, for which we're grateful to do. I've met many a Christian that finds beautiful and marvelous loopholes in the tax system to not have to pay the taxes that is due. Now, I'm not saying that, I'm not even going to go down that road. All I'm saying is pay your taxes. Why? Because God has instituted or put these institutions into place, and part of that is paying the taxes. So what makes the government law so different from God's law? We're sitting here, and I was asked to preach on our responsibility to the government. Well, have I given you really anything about our responsibility other than pay your taxes? I'll help you pay your taxes. Let me help you. I'll show you how to pay your taxes. Why? Because I want to pay the taxes so that the country can thrive. so that we're able to meet in this building with a free will to be able to worship our God. That we can come here on roads that are paved, so that we have electricity, so that we have all of these things and a functioning society. But what is our particular responsibilities to that of the government? Acts chapter 4, verses 18 through to 20 says, "So they called them and charged them, but not to speak or to teach at all in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered them, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge, for we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard." Little backstory to what was happening here. Peter and John were out preaching Jesus. The priests, remember what I said earlier about the priests and the government being two different organizations. The priests and the captain were concerned about Peter and John preaching Jesus. And between the two of them, they came together and said, we need to find a way to stop Peter and John from preaching Jesus. And they pulled them aside, and this is what they said to them. They said, we don't want you to preach and to teach of Jesus. And Peter and John's response were, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge, for we cannot but speak of what we have seen and what we have heard. Do we do God's will above anything else that we have? It's a good example. It's been cold the last couple of days. I've never been this cold before. I've never experienced cold like this before. We come from Cape Town, where we just come out of a drought, where we were down to the last, 20 or 30 days worth of water for the whole of the Western Cape. Some, whatever it was, 15 million people. We had 10 days worth of water left. The water that we used to bath ourselves and to shower with, we would then take to flush the toilets with. The water that would come out of the tap to boil in the kettle to make coffee, you would only take just enough to fill up your cup. Nothing more, nothing less. Why? Because if you fill up the kettle and you put it on to boil, you get the steam that comes out the top. That's water loss. We don't want that in Cape Town. And then we get here and we're told, hey, leave your tap to drip. And we go, hey, we're going down to Atlanta. We're going to be there for 5 days. You want me to drip the tap the whole time we're gone? It's foreign. It's crazy. I understand it now. It's hard to sometimes follow the laws of the land. In South Africa during COVID, you weren't allowed out of your house after, I think it was 9 p.m. at night. Why? Well, apparently that's when COVID came out to play. You weren't allowed to leave your house before 7 o'clock in the morning. Why? Because curfew. I wasn't allowed to go and visit my sister who lived 2 miles down the road because we lived in different households, and the government said that, well, that's how COVID's going to spread. It was hard. It was very hard. It was hard to come together as Christians to socialize. It was hard enough trying to keep in contact with Christians when all you're trying to do is go, well, how do I survive this? I'm not talking about the sickness. I'm talking about people being laid off from their jobs. I'm talking about businesses closing down. I'm talking about you're not getting a paycheck because your boss isn't getting paid from anybody else. And the government wants me to just sit at home and be happy with it? It was real, real hard. But every verse that I've looked at now so far has said to me, hey, Richard, God put those institutions in place. You've got to live with it. You've got to deal with it. You've got to be obedient to it. The one nice thing that is very contradictory, at least in America, to the Bible or to God's law, is that God's law is not a democracy. There's no voting on what we should or shouldn't be doing. We don't get together on a Sunday and go, okay, well, should we be feeding the hungry out on the street? Yes or no? No. The Bible is what it is and the message is there. We just need to obey. Whereas in America, we got a democracy. We get to vote. We get to decide who leads the country. We get to decide on what gets done with public land. We get to decide on all of these things by public participation. I shudder to think what God's law would be like if it was a democracy. Maybe if we had that island where we're still managed and run by the priests and the elders, it wouldn't be a problem. But man's too fickle for that. Acts chapter 5, verses 27 and 29, and I'm going to read that for us. I've put some verses up here, but I just want to go over it just because there's a little bit more context. Acts chapter 5, starting at verse 27, says, "And when they had brought counsel, and the high priest questioned them, saying, We strictly charge you not to teach in his name, yet here we have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you intend to bring this man's blood upon us. But Peter and the apostle answers, We must obey God rather than man." So the question is, when are we allowed to be disobedient to our government in response to God's law? The more that I sit back and the older that I get, I realize God's wisdom in a lot of things that I don't understand fully. Something as simple as, under the old law, they had to give 1/10 of their income. And everybody goes, oh, well, let's do tithings. Well, hold up there. It's not actually only 10%. Because once you start adding in the sacrifices and, you're probably looking closer at 35-40% of your income that you had to give. Well, what about taxes now? Well, now I start looking at that and I go, well, if I'm earning $100 and I've got to pay 30% to the tax man, well, now I'm only left with 70. Now you want me to give 40% more of my 100 to God. Well, what am I left with for groceries? Yet under the new law, the Christianity, we're told to give as we have prospered. And for the longest time, I didn't really understand what that means. But the more that I sit back and look at it, I go, that's God's wisdom. God's wisdom to say, hey, everybody here is different. You purpose in your heart what you will give back. It's hard sometimes, because sometimes I wish that I had a black and white answer that said, hey, Richard, you need to give 10% of every $100 that you make. Why? Because then there's no question about it. But here I am, and money to us, to Lindy and I, here in America, we're still trying to get our heads around it. It's weird here. It's different to South Africa. I knew in South Africa that X, Y, and Z, that's what I needed to buy, and that's what it's going to cost me, and I've got that remaining. Here, I can't find any sort of balance that says, well, a loaf of bread is going to cost me $5, and a cinema ticket's going to cost me $10. I just can't get the value of the money here and what it's actually worth. Why am I telling you that? Because I don't know what is normal to give on the first day of the week in terms of contribution. I simply don't know. At home, if somebody owed me 20 Rand, I'd go, don't worry about it. 20 Rand is nothing. 20 Rand in South Africa really is a loaf of bread. $20 on the other hand, I'm going, hey buddy, I need my $20. That's 2 Chick-fil-A meals. You got to pay up. I don't understand the value of it. But there's God's wisdom there. There's God's wisdom for us to look at ourselves and decide for ourselves what we ought to give. So let's go back to the COVID example. I'm just conscious of the time. Let's go back to COVID example. If we ever fell into the COVID situation again and the government forcibly locked us down, like they did in South Africa, how would we react? What would we do? Would we stand up to the government and say, hey, you played your hand the first time. This time we stand in our ground because we want to be obedient to our God. We will continue to go to church every single first day of the week. We will continue to gather on a Wednesday to have Bible study. We will continue to integrate with each other and to socialize. Why? Because I believe that there is a huge responsibility for socializing as Christians. Would we do that? Or would we turn around and go, oh, well, the government says I don't have to go to church on a Sunday because of COVID, but don't worry, we can go and walk in the forest for half an hour. It's okay to go and visit your friend down the road because it's only your family and theirs, but you can't go to church on Sunday. Why? Because there's going to be 50 families there. in that situation, I firmly believe that I can come here to Acts chapter 5 and verse 29 and repeat the words of Peter and say, we must obey God rather than man. Because at the end of this life, when I'm standing before my Father and he says to me, hey Richard, what did you do? Can I stand before him and say, I'm a good and faithful servant. I did your will above that of my own. I did your will above that of anybody else's or any other institution? Or will I stand before him and he goes, well, tell me your works. And I go, well, God, you see, I didn't really go to church because the government said that it's probably better if we stayed home. What about when we go to visit a country where it's frowned upon to be a Christian? I know personally preachers that have gone to China, and China is one of those touchy subjects, but I'll use it as an example, where they would have to sit and look like they're having a tea party on a Sunday. All their Bibles were digital because the government could lock you up if you owned a Bible. That they would sit there on a Sunday morning, learn from the scriptures, and if they heard a knock at the door, they would have their teacups ready next to them and they would all pick up their teacup and look as if they're having a tea party. They were wanting to be obedient to their God. They took the risk of going to prison. I don't know about you, but I definitely don't want to go to prison in China. I'll go back to prison in Uganda before I go to prison in China. So are we willing to stand up and do our Father's work over that of man? So I've listed down a couple of things to say, so what should we be doing as Christians in terms of our responsibility to government? 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Be respectful to our governments and to pray for them. Do we pray for our governments? Do we pray for authoritative figures? Or do we just kind of forget about them? I have a hard time sometimes just remembering who needs to be prayed for in our congregation here. And sometimes I need to pick up that email from Shane and go, okay, these are all the names. I don't know who you are. I don't know what you look like. And if you walk past me, I probably wouldn't know who you are. But I'm going to pray for you anyways. Do I remember to pray for our governments, for our leaders? I have two governments to pray for. One, America. Why? Because I'd love to eventually become an American, to be a true African American. Second of all, I have the South African government to pray for, who currently, our president is on the brink of being impeached for bribery and corruption. What is my prayer? If I even pray for them. Romans chapter 13, verse 1, we touched on earlier. We need to obey the laws of the land. Some of them are easy to do. Do not murder. Hey, that's not a problem for me. Do not steal. Hey, that's good for me too. Don't break the speed limit. Okay, next. Do we obey the laws of our land even when it's hard to do so? Because of opinion and not because of responsibility as a Christian. Pay our taxes, Matthew chapter 22, verses 15 through to 22. Now, I didn't touch on that story because I think it's a pretty well-known story. Shane preached on that one a couple of weeks ago. And that's Jesus being asked by the scribes and the Pharisees about collecting of taxes, where Jesus picked up the coin and said, well, whose face do you see on the front of it? Caesar's. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's. Pay your taxes, in other words. Acts chapter 5 and verse 29 is what we've just been talking about, rejecting of the law of the land when it contradicts that of God's law. It's not always a black and white issue. It's hard sometimes. I get it. It's hard. As much as I want to work in America, as much as I want to pay my taxes, as much as I want to do all of those things, I'm not allowed to. And people have said to me, well, Richard, what about just some cash on the dash? Do a job for cash and let them put it on your dash and you put it in your pocket and you walk away. Morally, I have an issue with that. Because first of all, it might jeopardize me being able to become an American citizen. Second of all, it pricks my conscience because I go, the Bible tells me to pay my taxes and to obey the laws of the land. It's a hard point for me. And the last one that I put up there is to work within the constraints of the law. Now, I want us to remind us that the law is there for the unlawful for the person that's breaking the law. As good abiding citizens, we shouldn't fear the law of the land. We should appreciate the law of the land. Imagine a society where there is no law. What would it be like? Many, many years ago, I watched a documentary where they took a bunch of strangers and they put them into this fake village. It was like an abandoned warehouses and homes or whatever the case is. And they were left there to their own devices. They had no contact with the outside world. They had no laws or rules that they had to abide by. There was no law given to them. There were no rule books. There was nothing. All that they were told by the producers were, you've got 40 days to survive. That's it. It didn't take them long before they were stealing from each other to enrich themselves. Food, shelter, fuel. Why? They had no rule. It's important that we have rules of the land. It's more important for us as Christians to follow them. And I want to leave this final thought with you. And the more that I get to preach here and to teach and to be involved, the more you will see this verse come up. Because this is my favorite verse in the scriptures. I will always go to it and always default back to it. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 13 says, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. You want to know what your responsibility is to the government? It's that. Fear God and keep his commandments, because that encompasses everything that we need to do. Both to him as our ruler, as our father, as well as to the government that we have, no matter where we are. And one day, we're going to unpack that word fear. Because the word fear has such a negative connotation to it. And I don't believe that that's what this fear is at all. This fear that we have here in Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 13 is a fear of respect. Respect God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. I urge you to take these thoughts and think about them during the week. If I've said anything this evening that you didn't quite understand because of my South African isms and the words that I use and the way that I come across, by all means, please pop me a text, chat to me afterwards, chat to me on Sunday. I know that there's some funny things that I say sometimes that I call it a calf muscle. Americans call it a calf muscle. It's the same thing. We're talking the same language. Sometimes we just get lost in translation. But think about these things. There is much more in the scriptures. When I got this topic from Bauer and I looked at this and I thought, what am I going to talk about? I've got no clue. And after I went through all my notes and my scribbles, I had to start taking out because I go, I've only got 45 minutes to talk. And I've already gone on for longer than that. There is so much in the scriptures that we can look at in terms of our responsibility as Christians to the government, to the authorities. Not just in a negative way, but also in positive ways. And there's also the examples of where we need to stand our ground against the authorities. Not because we don't like what they're saying, but because they're going against what God is saying. The lesson is yours. Thank you very much.